Hello, thank you everybody for joining back into the conference. It was a great keynote and we're ready to roll now into the emissions and air quality session. We have created a panel that's going to be split a little bit on two different topics. The first topic is going to focus on the air quality emissions and related issues or benefits from the sustainable aviation fuels. And then the second two speakers are going to focus on the transition from unleaded avgas. So what we're going to ask you to do is certainly if you have questions on these first two sessions, please start filtering them in, because if we get good questions, we're going to take a break in the middle and go through those questions first, since the topics are relatively different. So with that, I'm going to turn it to John Pehrson to introduce our first speaker. Thanks.
Thank you and good morning. Our first speaker is Tim Pohle. He's the Vice President of Environmental Affairs for Airlines for America. As an environmental attorney, Tim leads A4A's environmental and sustainability programs on behalf of the A4A airline members. He joined A4A in 2005 and has led A4A members in developing policies on environmental issues of national significance, including water quality, aircraft noise, and climate change. He has also represented A4A members for over a decade on the International Civil Aviation Organization's Committee on Environmental Protection, negotiating aircraft and aircraft engine standards. Tim works to address local air quality and noise issues at the state level. He has also been instrumental in providing leadership and counsel as the aviation industry has deepened its commitment to environmental and sustainability initiatives. A native of Madison, Wisconsin, Tim got his undergraduate degree at Yale University and a Juris Doctor cum laude at the University of Michigan Law School. Please help me welcome Tim Pohle.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our movement toward sustainable aviation fuel, really important to our organization and our airlines, and talk about it generally, but also how it relates a little bit to the local air quality issues as well. So if we could go to, do I control the slides or does? I do have a clicker. Okay, good. Good to know. All right. So just to give you some context, I just do want to say that we've been working on environmental issues for a long time, and we have commitments to work these issues that go back on the climate side, at least until 2009. And we have strengthened those targets, and we'll get to those in a second. But we also do not only climate change kind of is the headline issue, but noise and air emissions are incredibly important to our industry and incredibly important to making sure that we are addressing those, because we all know that continuing to grow and continuing to provide the basis for a thriving economy, we can't do that without becoming more sustainable, and that means becoming more sustainable on all fronts. And you can see that we have supported increased standards for NOx emissions, for particulate matter emissions. We're also have supported strong measures for climate change, including the adoption of what's known as the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, which is CORSIA. We also supported the development of a first of its kind CO2 emission standard for aircraft. And this is all done at the international level. It's important to do it there because you can't swap out engines, you can't swap out aircraft in between countries, obviously. So you need coordinated standards across the world. And we obviously work to progress these standards and get them incorporated into our national law. So we have been successful in growing our industry so that we're very important to it, the overall economy, driving about 5% of GDP while accounting for about 2% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions. And as Don pointed out, we've made tremendous progress on things like noise too, where the level of exposure to significant levels of noise have been reduced by 94%, while we've almost quadrupled the number of enplaned passengers. So I know that there's a lot of discussion around what those noise issues or the standards are going to be going forward. But, it shows that we can attack these problems. We know how to do it. We know how to continue to advance our industry, help folks get to where they need to go, help businesses get the services they need while addressing the crucial environmental issues that we all know. So we've got some basic ways forward here that should be fairly familiar to folks about how we attack environmental impacts. That's improved technologies, improved operations, improved infrastructure. But what I'm going to talk to you about is SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. Just to let you know, in the background here, we adopted a net zero carbon goal in 2021, in March of 2021. So it's a net zero carbon goal by 2050. And that initially was accompanied by a goal to reach 2 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. And that is the reality is that is the best lever we have to reducing emissions going forward. Operations will help, technology will help, but when you look at what's really going to bend the curve down towards zero, it's ultimately going to be a lot of SAF. So in September of this year, we also then increased that goal to 3 billion gallons of cost competitive SAF in 2030. And we really led the world in doing this. So the IATA, the International Air Transport Association, followed later in November, and actually the US government just adopted a net zero carbon goal later as well. And the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, adopted net zero carbon goal, an aspirational goal, just in October of last year. So another point here is we were doing this during COVID, which was really one of the worst economic times for our industry. And, when COVID first hit, the thought was perhaps that we would sit back, or not sit back, but that there would be less pressure across the industry and not just aviation. And people would think, well, maybe environment needs to take a bit of a back seat as we recover from the. Nothing could be further from the truth. We just re-upped our commitment to the environment, understanding that we need to make sure that as we progress economically, that is in lockstep with progressing environmentally as well. So you see here, this puts our carbon goal, our net zero carbon goal, and the relationship to our SAF goal in perspective. We're talking about a really, really difficult goal to achieve. We had about 15 million gallons of SAF produced in the United States last year, or available to carriers in the United States last year. So to get to 3 billion gallons, do the math, 200-fold increase. It's 94% increase every year from now through 2030. I always joke, if I could find an investment like that, I sure wouldn't be here. I'd probably be somewhere else enjoying the fruits of the investment. But so this is going to require getting about 22 to 35 billion gallons of SAF by 2050 to meet our net zero carbon goal. So we're talking about creating an industry, a production industry that's at least as large as the production that we have of traditional fuel today. It's a huge undertaking, but one that we're absolutely committed to. The good thing is that we're doing this in partnership with our friends across the aviation sector, including with consultations with environmental NGOs, aircraft and engine manufacturers, airports, but really the government needs to be a strong partner to really make this happen. And thankfully, we're totally aligned on what the goals should be, the net zero carbon by 2050 and the SAF goal by 2030 and beyond. And so we are definitely doing our part to try to make this transition. We've got various carriers with goals of getting 10% of their overall fuel use powered by SAF in 2030. Some have even gone as far as 30%. We're already taking production of SAF, even though it's about 2 to 5 times more expensive than traditional fuel at the moment. We're working across our value chain to partner with our corporate customers and other customers to help find ways to better finance this, because it really is more expensive. So there are various things that we're doing to really press this along as much as we can. As I said, there needs to be a strong partnership with the government. And as Don pointed out, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we got some really good incentives for SAF producers. So these are tax credits that go to the producers of sustainable aviation fuel. And you get a tax credit, they get a tax credit of $1.25 per gallon that can rise to about $1.75 per gallon if that fuel achieves a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to traditional fuel. You see that in order to even get to qualify, you need to have a fuel that reduces emissions by 50%. That's the basic threshold. And that's the basis of our goal as well. We're talking about using SAF that achieves at least a 50% reduction in fuels, or in greenhouse gas emissions from these fuels. So there are also grant programs that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act that helps with SAF. But frankly, this is a fantastic first step, but these will need to be augmented to really give SAF producers and investors the signals they need to make the decision to sink what really is going to be billions of dollars into this new industry. So we'd like to see these tax credits extended by 10 years from the time a facility goes into production. That's going to help draw in the private capital that's needed to really make this happen. But of course, we need to also enhance the funding that we've relied on as an industry for many, many years to do the basic research and development that leads to the development of the technologies that have allowed us to attack NOx, to attack PM emissions, to attack noise, bring those down. And we have programs under the FAA and through NASA, which are dedicated to developing these technologies and bringing really new ideas to a point of technology readiness level, which then industry can pick up the technology and bring it forward and provide the benefits that we have already seen us make, but or achieve. So going forward, we just need more of the same, because we can't stand still. We got to keep developing this. We got to get the pipeline started now. Otherwise, in 2050, we're just not going to have anything, new technologies that are ready to incorporate into our fleets that will manifest with new benefits and continued progress. So we need to keep this pipeline going. So I just want to say that even with the transition to SAF, SAF basically allows you to reduce your carbon, the life cycle carbon emissions from your aircraft. And you might think, well, then you can burn as much of it as you like. Well, the reality is, actually, you want it, as we have been motivated for many, many years, we want to burn as little fuel as possible. If we didn't have to pay for fuel, and that would be wonderful. So the least amount we can use is perfectly fine with us. So driving technologies which will improve fuel efficiency is really going to remain a primary focus of ours going forward. In this context today, I did want to point out, and I think Shruti will get to some of this, but there is less sulfur content there's basically no sulfur in sustainable aviation fuel. There are also other components that are not present in SAF as well, a component called aromatics. Basically, it allows the fuel to burn more cleanly, so it produces less soot, which means less particulate matter. So that's a very good health benefit, potential health benefit by ramping up our use of SAF. So I also want to emphasize that our effort to reduce PM and NOx emissions are not going to go by the wayside as we're focused on climate change and reducing carbon emissions, because those will remain very important issues for us, and we will keep our efforts up to drive new standards to get those emissions down from our engines. So I just want to emphasize at the end here that climate change is really a focus. It gets all the headlines. The way we're really addressing that, the most important lever that we have is this transition to sustainable aviation fuels. What I want folks to realize is that with the drive to sustainable aviation fuels, there will be local air quality benefits. And at the same time, we will continue to do the things that we have done for many years to try to drive the technology so that our emissions from our tailpipes go down and continue to go down. And it's not easy. There are a lot of interdependencies. You reduce NOx, it becomes more difficult to reduce or to improve fuel efficiency. You address noise, sometimes those technologies add weight to an aircraft, which can reduce fuel efficiency. So doing it all together can be difficult, but we've proven that we can do it. And we are committed to addressing each and every one of these aspects, and we'll continue to do that going forward. So thanks very much. Appreciate you listening.
Our next speaker is Dr. Shruti Mishra. She is a senior member of the technical staff at Sandia National Labs. She completed her master's and PhD degrees at the Ohio State University, where she has trained as an applied economist. Her work includes energy economics and ecosystem services valuation. As a Fulbright scholar and employee at the U.S. Department of Energy National Labs. She's also worked for the U.S. Geological Survey and the World Bank. Dr. Mishra works at the interface of energy, environment, climate change, and economic analysis, where she is coupling the biophysical models with the economic models to generate information on the economic costs and benefits of energy innovations. Her analysis goals are to support the assessment of economic viability and environmental sustainability of energy technology and innovation. And in this symposium, she will share with us her recent work on the evaluation of the health benefits associated with the use of sustainable aviation fuel. Dr.
Hello, everybody. I'm working right now at Sandia National Lab, and at Sandia National Lab, they do a lot of work on this fuel molecules and techno-economic analysis, how to reduce the cost, how to improve the molecules itself, how to do the LCA, life cycle analysis. So they are doing work on different aspects of sustainable aviation fuel And the work that I am going to present is a very small part, just looking at the health benefits of sustainable aviation fuel. So the basic difference between the jet fuel and the sustainable aviation fuel is sustainable aviation fuel contains near zero level sulfur and also low quantity of aromatic species, which results into lower emissions. So when jet fuel combustion happens, it releases a number of air pollutants, and that impacts population in the LTO pathways. There are a number of studies which has already quantified how many premature death happens because of these aviation emissions, and also in the context of increasing share of aviation emissions from 3% to 15% of the overall emission, it's important to look at whether and how sustainable aviation fuel can be a part of the solution. The number of studies have quantified how blending of sustainable aviation fuel into jet fuel could reduce air pollutants. They have, for example, this Binosa et al., they quantified under different blending, 50% and 100% blending of sustainable aviation fuel produced from different conversion pathways, how much of particle number emission can be reduced. So it goes all the way from 20% to 90% reduction. And some studies from Harvard, such as Arter et al., they have quantified how the reduction in air pollutants by SAF use lead to reduction in mortalities and morbidities. So the benefits of sustainable aviation fuel not only includes the decarbonization or emission in greenhouse gas, but also the co-benefits, which is health benefits from improved air quality in the LTO pathways. So today we are going to present how we can quantify the health benefits of sustainable aviation fuel. And we also try to disaggregate those benefits to the disadvantaged communities as well. And by health benefit, we are looking at the reduction in the number of mortalities and morbidities due to the improved air quality from SAF use. So we developed this method, which has 4 main components. We try to quantify the air pollutants from using jet fuel versus using the blended SAF and jet fuel at various proportion. Second part, we try to look at the area of influence. Third part, we try to quantify the change in mortality and morbidity due to increased use of SAF. And fourth part is the quantification of SAF-led reduction in the number of mortalities, including those to target disadvantaged communities. So this is the equation we used to calculate the health benefit, which include the change in pollution, change in the number of mortalities around the population living in the area of influence, and the damage cost. So we are going to look at each of these components one by one. If we look at the prior studies, which try to quantify the change in air pollutants from jet fuel versus SAF blending with jet fuel, this is something that we can see wherein sulfur dioxide emission reduction ranges anywhere from 4% to 50%. Particulate matter reduction from anywhere from 2.4% to 55%, and so on. So initially, we thought maybe we could use the results from other studies, but then we also found this airport air quality manual, which is developed by ICAO, and they use this first order approximation method to quantify the emission indices. So we tried to use the same method to first quantify the total baseline particulate matter from airport around the LTO pathways of that airport. And then we also calculated the particulate matter for SAF, particulate matter from SAF using the same equation, where we used the value of fuel sulfur content as 0. In terms of the area of influence, prior studies have found anywhere from 7 kilometer to 40 kilometer as the area of influence for the particulate matter emissions and its impacts. So we try to use 10 kilometer to 40 kilometer as our area of influence, downwind of airport as the area of influence. In terms of the change in mortality and morbidity, we used the CDC's Center for Disease Control's estimated decrease in mortality. So they have the data on how many mortalities can be reduced under different reduction in particulate matter, like 5%, 15%, 25%. So we use that. So in terms of this disadvantaged communities living around the airport, you can see in this figure the disadvantaged communities in the darker purple color and blue color. We also try to identify those tracts around this is an example of Los Angeles airport. So around 10 kilometer, 25 kilometer, and 40 kilometer of LAX, how many tracts are disadvantaged? And we use the data from DOE as well as the Cal environment screen for getting to this data. The last one is the damage cost. So there is this standard method, the state-of-art method for assessing the value of premature mortalities, this is the value of statistical life, and that is developed by Environmental Protection Agency. And they have, like, this is not the ideal way. We can't tag the dollar value, but this is what we have. And I'm trying to, use what is available to at least have some sense of, what is the damage cost of air pollution. And then if we can reduce some mortalities using SAF, that would be the avoided damage cost. So that would be the benefit, health benefit from the sustainable aviation fuel. We try to just look at where these disadvantaged tracts are located in the context of the major US airports and the tracts that are exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And as you can see in this figure, there are a number of airports, specifically in the Midwest and the western part of the US, where we see a remarkable overlap between the tracts that are exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standard and the location of the airport, and also the location of these disadvantaged communities. So today I am going to share the preliminary results from one of the airport, that is the Los Angeles airport. This is the average emission from landing and takeoff that we calculated. We have it for different stages of landing and takeoff cycle. We also try to quantify if we use 50% SAF blending for the total quantity of fuel used for the Los Angeles airport, how much particulate matter could be reduced. So we found anywhere from 3 to 23% reduction in particulate matter mass if we have 50% SAF blending in lax. And with 100% SAF, we get to 5 to 47% reduction in particulate mass. In terms of the disadvantaged tracts within the area of influence, we identified respectively 182, 775, and 1123 tracts that are identified as disadvantaged within the 10 kilometer, 25 kilometer, and 40 kilometer of lax airport. For our further analysis, we try to use only those tracts which exceed the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. In this slide, we are trying to show the distribution of the mortalities reduced due to SAF-related emission reduction. We have 4 panels here. The first 2 panels are the lower bound estimate, and the second, left-hand side panels, like right-hand side of yours, that is like high upper bound estimates. And all those red dots are the tracts where at least one mortality could be if the sustainable aviation fuel is used in the lax airport. One thing and this is preliminary results, and one thing to note here is the disadvantaged communities get the highest benefit from use of sustainable aviation fuel in the lax airport. And we also try to monetize those values of the health benefits. Again, same thing, we have the lower bound estimate and upper bound estimate. And the first panel shows the overall monetary benefits. And the second panel is just the benefits to the disadvantaged communities. And again, the pink color tracts that you can see, those tracts can generate as much benefit as 9.5 to those tracts can receive as much benefit as 9.5 to 18.6 million US dollar per year due to the SAF use in lax airport. In summary, we see a remarkable overlap of non-attainment areas, concentration of disadvantaged communities, and the major US airports, and use of the low or no sulfur sustainable aviation fuel can reduce aviation emission and could generate potential health benefits to people living around the LTO pathways and also to the disadvantaged communities living around that area. In our preliminary results, we found that 83 to 100% of the benefits, health benefits of SAF could go to the disadvantaged communities. And as the aviation emissions share could increase from 3% to 15%, whether SAF could be a promising option towards addressing the impacts of aviation emissions. With that question, I would like to stop my presentation here. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes between this and the next session, so we'll try taking on a couple of the questions that came in. First question is to Mr. Pohle. How does the 3 billion gallons of SAF manufacturing goal compare to the total fuel consumption in aviation?
Okay, thanks. It takes me a while, but I appreciate it. Roughly 10 to 12%. It's projected to be about 10, 12% of predicted uplift in 2030.
Jet fuel.
Of jet fuel.
Yeah, we have Avgas folks on this panel too, so. Yeah, so 10 to 12% of the projected total use of jet fuel in 2030 is SAF if they can get to the 3 billion gallon goal.
Correct.
Next question will be for Dr. Mishra. You shared economic impacts to emissions. Do other organizations, for example, the FAA, support economic implications in evaluation of such as what you've shared? Does the FAA also use monetary methods to evaluate benefits? That may not be a question that you can answer, so that's okay.
Yeah. I would like to deflect that question to FAA people.
Yeah, is there anybody from FAA in the room that could provide an answer?
Don's over there, but my understanding is that AEDT does have the capability of looking at the monetary, translating environmental impacts into monetary impacts.
The underlying research was done by mostly by Kip Viscusi, who was at Harvard for most of his life, lawyer who is an environmental economist as well. He's been at Vanderbilt for kind of his twilight in a named professorship, but it has been standard for decades to use the value of a statistical life in these analyses.
Thank you. Tim, another one for you. Your slide says aircraft account for 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. EPA says 10%. Even BP says 9%. Is there a reason for the difference?
Yes, because you're wrong. Because EPA, all you need to do is look at the GHG inventory that they produce, and it shows that we're actually most recently less than 2%. During COVID, we were far less than 2%. But we're right around 2% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions. That's in EPA's greenhouse gas inventory, which is available publicly.
Thank you. Dr. Mishra, did you break out the more dangerous subgroup of PM 2.5 from total PM in your studies? If so, or if not, why not?
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, we have another part of the analysis wherein we are trying to quantify the impacts of ultrafine particles on preterm birth, but that particular work is still underway.
Dr. Mishra, one more, and this will be the last one for this session. What gaps exist in quantifying benefits and impacts of SAF blends on airport communities? What gaps exist?
I think I am also new to the externalities and estimation, understanding the externalities of aviation emissions. I have started this work fairly recently, but one thing that we could figure out is, trying to look at it from the, benefits of improved fuel versus looking at the negative externalities of existing practices. So that is the angle that we are trying to look at, but maybe that is not the answer you're looking for.
All right, thank you.
Could I just comment really quickly on that? As Don alluded to, there's a Aviation Sustainability Center and clean program under FAA, NASA research programs, been looking at this issue of what are the health impacts associated with aviation and trying to identify these gaps for many, many years. And so there has been a concerted effort within FAA and within the broader community to identify those and fill them.
Right, thank you. So that we have time for the discussion of aviation gasoline and the issues associated with that, we'll turn it over to that group. Eric.
Thank you very much, Tim, Shruti, for the talks. Hopefully you all see that there are a lot of interesting things that we're continuing to learn about the benefits and outcomes from the use of sustainable aviation fuels. We think it's a really great that Shruti's team is investing into that and helping us understand what those are, because I think it's all a concern for us. We are going to shift now to the GA side and the other fuels in aviation aircraft, the Avgas. And we have two great speakers to give us some perspectives on that effort. Chris DaCosta has worked in leadership positions in the oil and gas industry for over 35 years. He began his career as a consultant, serving many major international clients. In 2012, he was appointed CEO of Swift Fuels, a privately held research and development company. And under his leadership, Swift has become a global leader in the development of the next generation of fuels and process technologies. I've seen him speak before, and I'm excited for him to share some of the great things that they're working on in the transition to unleaded Avgas.
How's everybody doing today? There you go. It's my pleasure to be here today. We're going to talk about unleaded aviation gasoline. This is the gasoline that goes into piston airplanes, propeller airplanes. You see them all over the place. For the last, 80 plus years, those airplanes have been fueled off of leaded avgas. The lead is the proponent, the octane booster, which makes it, gives it the octane characteristics. Basically 100 motor octane is what happens with aviation gasoline we have today. In your car, when you go to the pump, if you buy 87, let's say, the motor octane of 87 is probably about 82 or 83 maybe. So to get to 100 motor octane and avgas means you're 16, 17 octane points higher than that. So the gasoline that we're talking about for aviation gasoline is substantially high compared to typical auto gas. So Swift Fuels, I'm the CEO of Swift Fuels. We have a facility in West Lafayette, Indiana, the home seat of Purdue University. Another shout out for, never mind. And we have a significant amount of different types of work going on there. We do a lot of work with light gases, converting light gases to premium grade fuels, which is an exciting new part of our business. We've done a significant amount of work in jet fuel, what's now called SAF. It's had other terms in the past, but we made an aromatic component to that fuel for quite some time. And we were in the clean program with the FAA for 6 to 8 years in that process. Today, I'm going to focus on one segment of what we do, which is aviation gasoline. And if you want to know more about that, there's a website reference to Swift Fuels Avgas, which talks a little bit more about what we do. You see those tanks there. We currently, not only do we do the research on what are the best alternatives for the high octane unleaded fuel, but we also make the fuel. So I'll start out by saying we sell premium unleaded avgas. We, on the left here of this slide, we sell a product called UL94. It's a minimum 94 motor octane avgas, which is not as high as 100, obviously. And we've been in the hunt for the 100 octane fuel for the last 10 or 12 years with a number of other companies, a lot of major oil companies. But we decided back in 2015 to introduce UL94 as a stepping stone to the process. It was readily available to us. We have proprietary rights to it. We have created the paperwork, the certification documentation through the FAA, and also the specification work through ASTM International, which is a group of voluntary industry folks from around the world that meet to talk about standards for things like fuel. So we've orchestrated all of that together for UL94, and we began, like I said, selling it in April of 2015. It's been just over 8 years now that fuel has been in the market. In the meantime, we've been the FAA orchestrated a program called PAFI, P-A-F-I, which was active from 2014 to 2018. And then it went through a regen after that. And it's now part of what's called EAGLE. And you're going to hear from Robert Ogerslanger. He's a partner friend of mine, and he'll be on the next discussion here in just a few minutes. And he'll tell you a little bit more about the EAGLE program. And inside the EAGLE program is a regeneration of the PAFI process too. Swift, on the other hand, has chosen a slightly different path. The path we chose for 94, it's listed on there. It's called a supplemental type certificate. It's a permission from the FAA to supplement what the engines and airframes are approved to use. They're approved to use different grades of octane, including 100. But in our case, 70% of the US fleet can use UL 94. It's more like 75% of the US fleet. So it's a subset of the total fleet that can use 94. And if airports have the capacity to store our fuel and service that segment of the fleet, which there's quite a lot of those airplanes, 70% of the fleet, then those pilots can use this fuel today. It's important to reemphasize the steps that are in the process. So I talk about this a lot and I get a lot of questions about this. So to have a qualified commercially available fuel, you have to have an ASTM production specification, basically 150 people, a room maybe a little bigger than this, filled with experts on fuel from all the major oil companies, all the major engine manufacturers, all the major airframe makers, and then various and sundry other international fuel experts. They meet and they throw rocks at everybody's new idea for a spec. And in order to get through that process, and there is a manageable way to do it, you have to have technical merit overturn a negative. So if everybody can kind of come to consensus on what stands up as being a proper spec, and you overturn any and all negatives, you get to the point where you have a production spec. And we have that for UL 94, and we're working on that with our 100 octane fuel as well. We sell the certificates we've earned from the FAA for $100. So if a pilot has an airplane and it's qualified to use our fuel, they pay us $100. We send them an information kit, operating instructions, something they put in their glove box that says, here's the limitations of what I need to know to have your proper certificate from the FAA. And they're good to go. And then the fuel gets bought by the airport. We manage that whole process, hand in glove kind of thing, to make sure that everything is proper. Our fuel weighs exactly what low lead weighs, 5.87 pounds per gallon. It's drop-in ready. And if you use our fuel, what happens? You stop having lead fouling. What does that mean? It means that you, instead of going every 50 hours to have the lead cleaned out of your spark plugs and out of your fuel system, you go every 100 hours because it's cleaner. And furthermore, over time, that cleanliness results in less engine wear and tear. Lead gets into the oil system, it's acidic, it creates corrosion, and eventually that corrosion wears out the engine. So every 2,000 hours, you have to have your engine overhauled. That's the way lead has worked for 80 years. You take the lead out and it runs clean, pilots benefit. So why did we do this? Why did Swift decide to do it this way? We wanted pilots to understand it's not just we all want lead because of the emissions. We also, the pilots benefit. They have an economic benefit for operating their airplanes with a more efficient and a cleaner fuel. So it's a double win. I call it a win-win-win. So there at the bottom, it says we eliminate toxic lead. So it's been used nationwide. A recent phenomenon, if you're, being my California audience, I don't speak in California that often, but here we are. So a lot of people ask me, well, why isn't it here? Well, it's here. It's been here. It's been here quite a lot. And the number of airports that are using it is growing. I'm very excited about that. That's why I'm here, happy to talk about it. You can see we have a concentration more up in the Northern California area, and there's 4 or 5 airports now in Southern California area, and the list is growing. We probably get 2 or 3 or 4 a month come along and say, hey, we want to be added to your list, and we go through an onboarding process, and there you go. There have been a lot of political lawsuits, things like that regarding communities and why aren't they moving faster to unleaded fuel and stuff like that. Well, there is a process, and we're trying to work with communities, all the stakeholders. Who's that? The FAA, the airport, the pilots. Sometimes it's the community, like a municipality or a city that runs an airport. There's FBOs that are like gas stations at airports that all have a role to play. There's the community that lives nearby whose airspace is affected by this. A lot of constituents. So in order to engage in that conversation, we have webinars, we talk to pilots, we talk to communities, we talk to governments about, how this could affect them, what steps they need to take, how they can do it time efficiently, cost effectively. Some of them want to devise incentives for their communities. We had one airport that paid the $100 for each of the STCs so that they could get their pilots on board. Flight schools that are often at these airports, which might be 20 airplanes, 50 airplanes, 150 airplanes in a flight school at an airport. Those guys are flying all the time. They're flying all the time. And most of those airplanes are airplanes that are compatible with UL 94. So when they use our fuel, here's what happens. You have a training student, you fly hours, then you got to stop and you got to change your oil and have it cleaned. Well, now you don't have to do that, but once every 100 hours. Sometimes they go out on the ramp and they're going to start up your engine. They run a test on the runway and they do a mag check and the airplane fails. Well, then it's got to go to the shop. So then the airplane trainer and the student lose their hour of flight or whatever it was planned to be because it's got to go to the shop. That's called opportunity cost. They spend money for not being able to fly. So all of that is fixed by having a clean running unleaded fuel. Here's our nationwide map. I know it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little yellow dot in Indiana. That's where I live. That's where Purdue is. And we move the fuel from there. You saw those tanks a few minutes ago. We make all the fuel there today. We're working with third parties right now to spread this out and make it more universal. But today, right now, we're moving fuel all the way to California, all the way to Texas, all the way to Florida, all the way to New York, and all across the Midwest. That's happening now. So our high octane fuel, which we've been working on with a serious intent for probably 3 to 4 years now, it's running the same path. Okay, it's going to be equally cost competitive. It's going to be equally low toxicity. It's going to be the cleanest burning of the fuels. Why the cleanest? EST, cleanest. That's because it has an oxygenate in it. It's got an oxygen compound that complements the hydrocarbons that are in it so that when it combusts, it's the cleanest combustion of all the candidates. And because of that, we get a better production on power. We get better emissions out the tailpipe. You know, all that. It's equivalent more or less. It's not the same thing, but it's equivalent to like ethanol and gasoline. Ethanol is also an oxygenate so that when it's like 10% in E10 gasoline, when it combusts, it tends to improve the combustibility of what happens in the piston, in the cylinder, such that it makes cleaner combustion. Well, ours does the same thing, but it doesn't use ethanol. So, but it is a 10% renewable component. So there's something for it's not SAF, but it's 10% renewable. Yay. Cleanest burning avgas, also the same weight, 5.87 pounds per gallon. And it adheres to the same kind of ASTM International standards. It's another important point. The United States has environmental standards that we think are important. Well, so does Europe, and so does Japan and China and Latin America and other parts of the world. But sometimes our international standards are out of sync with some of theirs. And now what we're trying to find is the most compatible solution that's compatible with everybody's international standards, so they'll all buy into it. Why? Because low lead is used worldwide and everybody wants the lead to go worldwide. So you got to find a solution that's worldwide compatible, and that's what this point is trying to make. At the bottom of the slide, this is really complicated, but you're bearing with me so far. What are the rules that allow the FAA to approve a fuel? Well, there's a bunch of title, 14 CFR, la-di-da-di-da, these codes in the Federal Register for how, or in the, US law, how an airframe and how an engine must be judged by the FAA to comply with something like a fuel. So we have to follow those minimum federal aviation regulations. The FAA has to follow those minimum, those are legislated, right? The Congress has told the FAA, here are the minimum standards we want things to follow. So the FAA is the enforcer of that standard. In addition to that, there are additional requirements that the engine makers might want. They may be more particular, more tailored, more unique, more special. So we try to accommodate those along with the minimum FAA standards. And then we try to accommodate ASTM that says, well, all these oil and gas experts say, I think it should do this and that. And you need to think about this. This might corrode, or that might cause a fabric problem, or this could do something to paint, or this could do something to bladders or sealants or O-rings or elastomers. So there's this constant, barrage of thought, which is constructive thought, trying to find out what's the best way to do this. And what we're trying to do, our formula, that's what the bottom chart says, our formula is to listen to all of that input, not just the minimum FAA standards, and develop the broadest, deepest solution that will apply to 100R. And that is exactly what we're doing. So some other people say, well, I only think I need to follow the minimum FAA standard and I'll stop there. I don't think ASTM is important. I don't think the OEMs are important. I don't think any of that other stuff's important. I just think the FAA is the only one that should vote. Well, guess what? It isn't quite that simple. And that's why we're doing the broad, deep way to do it. Does that make sense? So we hire experts of all different fields. I employ, probably 3 or 4 or 5 pilots on any given day because they're all in different stages of their certification as pilots. But a number of pilots that fly airplanes. We have 3 PhD chemists. We have a significant amount of engineers, most of them from Purdue, that are part of our employee set. And then we have contractors that are experts in their field, some of whom are actually called designees from the FAA. They're certified by the FAA to work with companies like ours to get us over the hurdle. And that's what they're doing. And then we engage with the FAA on a regular basis. The FAA assigns a certification office as the leader of our work. And so we have to work, not have to, we work with them on a day in, day out basis. And those designees help guide us, keep us between the rails, in terms of how we go about doing the work. So, for the last several years, we've been the chief architect of getting unleaded avgas into the market. We're working diligently as the sole provider. We have been for the last 8 years. We're engaged in continuing collaborations with all these FBOs that I mentioned. We're planning a rollout of our high octane fuel, hopefully later this year. It's not totally up to me. I mean, the FAA has to be ready. The ASTM has to be ready. There's third parties that are participating, but they all know that I've publicly said it's our intent to have this out later this year. So that's what we're trying to do. We're engaged in collaborations with Eagle. You're going to hear from Robert in just a second. He'll talk about the FAA. So just to be clear about this, we have what I called the STC process for UL 94. We have an STC process for 100R, and there's going to be a time when we merge our STC program for 100R along with the PAFI program that's part of Eagle. So Robert's going to talk about what PAFI and Eagle are working on. And we see a way to, when we get a certain amount of our certification done, we'll already be in the market, but we want to get some other things done that only they can help us do. So when that point comes, we'll merge with what's called the PAFI program or part of the Eagle program. And that, so real fast, why is that? Here's why that is. How many airplanes, piston airplanes are there? 223,000. How many of them are FAA certificated airplanes? 179,000. Which ones can the FAA certify with an STC? 179,000. What are those other things? They're experimental. Some of them are what are called orphan, where they've lost their parentage of their OEMs because they've gone out of business 50 years ago or something. There's a lot of odds and ends in this category of, call it, unspecified non-FAA certificated airplanes. They fly and they have permission to fly, but they're not part of the normal FAA certificated line. So we get FAA approvals through the FAA certificated line, but then there's this other stuff. So we go to PAFI to get all of that whole enchilada accommodated. And that's why we need their help beyond just the STC program. Hope that sort of makes sense. So 1 or 2 more slides. So people say, well, gee, it's simple. You make a fuel, you put it in the market, everybody comes and buys it, no sweat. Really? So you have to understand FAA regulations, ASTM International, OSHA, like all of our safety data sheets. A lot of information that we have to put the fuel into the market requires OSHA approval. There's the DOT that oversees the FAA. There's other bodies, there's EPA there, so obviously air quality and fuel quality. Then there's a row of OEMs, Lycoming, Continental, Beechcraft, Textron, Cessna, Piper. They're all the original equipment manufacturers for engines and airframes. They all have to be happy. Then there's trade groups, ALPA's pilots, NBAA's airports or aviation, general business aviation. Gamma is aviation manufacturers. That'll be engines and airframes in the orange one there. NATA is air transportation nationwide. API is oil and gas industry. There's fire. There's a number of other, like the local fire department oversees every tank at an airport. There's just so many people you have to collaborate with to get the compliance just right. And that's indicative of this. And then the bottom row are the insurance companies. So you can't do this without carrying $50 to $200 million worth of insurance on every single deal you do. And they all have to review all this paperwork, all these standards, all your ASTM specs and everything else to make sure that it's all prim and proper. That's what it takes to deliver fuel. That's what we do. Here's our website. You can learn more about us. There's an FAQ that answers a bunch of questions if you might have those. And it's my pleasure to spend some time with you to enlighten you on what we're doing at Swift Fuels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. He's a wealth of info, so I encourage you to send in questions or speak to him afterwards. Next up will be Robert Olaslagers, who unfortunately couldn't make it here in person. So we will have a nice picture on screen for you all to see here. He is a senior coordinator at Eagle, which is the Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions Group. He's going to tell you more about it, so I'm not going to do that now. He's served in a number of airport leadership positions, focusing on priorities including economic development, environmental sustainability, aviation security, and workforce development. He's participated in several National Academy of Sciences and ACR program studies. And notably notably under his watch, Centennial Airport became one of the first general aviation airports in Colorado to adopt a sustainability program. He's leading this group, which is very important in terms of this transition effort to unleaded avgas. So I'm excited to have him share with you what their plans are.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Greetings from Southwest Florida. Would have liked to have joined you. But appreciate being invited to the conference here. I participated on many way back when Berkeley, UC Berkeley ran it as the Aviation Noise Symposium down in San Diego. So it's good to be back at this program. Recognizing that I'm standing between you and lunch, I will make this fairly quickly. Appreciate Chris DeCosta's outstanding overview of SWIFT's programs, but in particular the 100R and the UL94 transition that they are working on. A little bit about Eagle itself. We consist of 11 industry and government organizations. Eagle, which stands for Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions, is a coalition. I actually report to 9 CEOs and the federal government, and our mission is quite simple. Could I have the next slide, please? It's to eliminate aviation gasoline, as we've talked about, lead emissions before the end of 2030, and I'll get to that here in a second, without adversely affecting the safe and efficient operation of the general aviation fleet. Eagle, as you can see, we've got 9 aviation associations representing the bulk, probably 98% of all of the general aviation association communities, as well as the American Petroleum Institute, which is a big partner in Eagle, and of course the Federal Aviation Administration. If we can go to the next slide, we're set up into 4 different groups. On the left side, you see light blue colored, we call them pillars. The supply chain, infrastructure and deployment pillar, and the research and development and innovation pillar, which is basically managed by industry. And then on the right, you see the darker blue pillars, the unleaded fuel evaluation, authorization, and regulation policy and programmatic activities pillars. These are all interdependent, and I basically do the coordination between the activities of all of the 4 pillars. And it's a really just a great program. I've been managing airports. The last airport I was at was Centennial Airport. I believe there are 2 Centennial Airport members in the audience right now. It was a sincere privilege working in the airport industry. So it's been a bit of a learning curve for me. But let me explain a little bit about what we're doing with all of these pillars, if you will, and how they operate and how they interact with each other. So the supply chain infrastructure pillar obviously looks at the supply chain itself, literally from the refineries to the distributors, blenders, and airports, and then ultimately FBOs, and then fuel going into the wings. It's a process that has been tried, tested, and true. It works very well. Certainly SWIFT is part of that whole process, and we're just very excited. In fact, Centennial Airport tomorrow will be unveiling its UL94 unleaded fuel at Centennial Airport, so pretty excited about that. The R&D pillar focuses on new technologies to improve operating efficiencies, but also if the octane levels fall short of where we need to be, especially for the high compression engines. That is where we would look at new operating standards and possibly some new equipage. Beyond that, we're also obviously looking at modernizing some of the engine technology. Frankly, we're very far behind the automobile industry in that regard. For example, just to name one, electronic ignitions are not present at most airplanes, general aviation piston aircraft today. So that's something that we're looking at, making more aircraft more efficient, burn less fuel, and being able to operate more efficiently. The third pillar is the Unleaded Fuel Evaluation Authorization Program. Chris briefly mentioned the PAFI program. And I'll talk about the acronyms here in a second. SWIFT, in fact, did participate in the PAFI program for some time, but ultimately ended up going to the STC process, which is faster, but it's also a little more proprietary in terms of how things are done. At the end of the day, the FAA does look at all of those proprietary processes as well. So, and then finally, the regulation policy programmatic activities are at some point we have to follow new regulations. The Air Quality Act, as amended, will trigger a number of regulatory and statutory requirements that ultimately will have to be borne out. So, give an example. As I mentioned before, if we fall short on, say, meeting that octane requirement that Chris was talking about earlier, we might be able to reduce some settings, do some other things, increase fuel flowage, et cetera, to keep cylinder head temperatures down. We can get into the weeds very quickly, which I don't want to do here today, but these are some of the things that we look at. And that's where the interdependencies come between all of those four pillars. And it's quite exciting for me to actually come out of retirement and start working on that again. If we can go to the next slide, please. I want to just briefly mention, Chris mentioned we've got about 220,000 aircraft, 223. Numbers vary a little bit depending on what database you're looking at. It's a $245 billion annual industry. And employs about 1.2 million employees. There's about 5,000 public use airports, 35,000 that sell 100 low lead at the present, and that's our target audience, obviously. Incidentally, there's about 20,000 landing facilities in the United States. A lot of these include, helipads for oil rigs and for hospitals, law enforcement facilities. Chris mentioned about 70% that can use the lower octane because they have the lower compression engine, so they don't require quite as high an octane. Think of it as in terms of you buying 87 octane that Chris mentioned, which is regular fuel, versus say 91 to 93, which would be described as premium fuel. So you can kind of see the difference between higher performing engines versus the lower performing compression engines. Having said that, that 70%, 68% only use 25% of the total fuel volume in the United States. And the other 30% roughly will need the 100 low lead or an equivalent unleaded fuel that will get at least up to the 100 octane plus fuel. So they're the bulk of the users of fuel today. To give you an idea, that total annual aviation gas volume, which is about 160 to about 180 million gallons a year, equates to 4 days of automobile consumption. That really comes down to about 0.1% if you do the math on that. So it's a very small market. It's a very almost boutique market. And we are grateful that companies like Swift are still interested in looking at that, as well as the larger, the big oil companies that all of us know. So it's a great time to have all of these folks participate. A little bit about tetraethyl lead, which is the lead additive that is added to fuel today. It prevents engine knock, which could cause catastrophic failure. Literally cracking cylinder heads in flight. It's not like pulling over by the side of the road with your automobile. So it's something that that, you want to be looking out for. And one of the things that they do when they do these engine tests and these new fuels, that's one of the things that they look at, many detonation tests, if you will. And so that is one of the things that lead prevents. The other thing that it does that Chris also mentioned is it basically produces power. However, we also know that lead is a known neurotoxin. It was actually used all the way back in Roman times. They added it to their cheap wine to sweeten it up a little bit. And especially some of the emperors that liked wine back in the day, by the end of their lives, they were quite batty because of it. But lead also helped win World War II when octane was pushed all the way up to 115 octane, and it made our P-151 fighters much faster than anything that the Germans had. So next slide, please. So why now? The EPA proposed an endangerment finding last year in 2022 towards the end of the year, and we are anticipating that there will be a positive endangerment finding regarding lead in piston engine fuel. So once that positive endangerment finding comes out, that triggers a number of statutory and regulatory requirements, including proposed rules that will include public hearings, cost-benefit analyses, et cetera, et cetera. It may even, as happened in the automobile industry, involve some lawsuits. So each of these steps is expected to take several years. And so when we looked at the 2030 date from the aviation side to make that transition, that was kind of a target date. However, we are very keenly interested in finding a solution prior to that. And as you heard from Chris, hopefully his 100R will come out in 2023. So we would already be looking at making those transitions. So let's talk a little bit about the alternatives that we're looking at right now that were mentioned here before. There are two pathways. One is the Piston Alternative Fuels Initiative, or PAFI, and the other one, as was mentioned, is Supplemental Type Certification, or STC, or in this case also the approved model list, meaning very specific to certain aircraft engines and certain aircraft types. So it's important to understand that significance. And when Chris was talking about having that fuel for all aircraft, at some point, the PAFI program is designed to do fleet-wide authorization, meaning it would include all of the aircraft, including the ones that might be orphaned at this point. So if we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, the PAFI program, which stands for the Piston Alternative Fuels Initiative. We're currently going through Gate 3, if you will, with both Afton Chemical and Phillips 66, as well as Lyndell, Basel, and VP Racing. We expect that that process will be completed in July. And we then hope to go to the next phase, which would be not only the mini durability and a mini detonation test, but we will go to full detonation, or at least by that time, the detonation issue should be resolved. But we'll be looking at the durability, which will probably involve at least 300 hours of operating requirements. So hopefully by July, we may have two more fuels in the hopper. Now, these two fuels are also going through the ASTM process, used to be called the American Standards and Testing Materials program. Now it's just simply called the ASTM. It is not a mandatory requirement, but it is highly recommended for the very reasons that Mr. DaCosta talked about earlier, and that is it sets the standards for quality. So currently there are two fuels in that program. Number one is, so that's the PAFI program. If we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the STC process. So GAMI, or the General Aviation Modifications Incorporated, received its AML STC certification on 1 September of 2022. The fuel is currently not yet commercially available on the market. It also does not have an ASTM approval. So SWIFT, which is in the STC program, does expect to get authorization in 2023 this year. And one of the interesting things is that the UL 94 switch to 100R would be relatively simple. And having SWIFT already having the sort of distribution network and airports that are already using the UL 94 unleaded fuel, I think that's going to be very important. Most important from our perspective is that it expects to receive the ASTM approval, which is an international standard for how the fuel is blended and ultimately delivered into wings of aircraft. So those are those two pathways to success. We ultimately will have 4 fuels. However, that probably, given the market, as I mentioned earlier, about 0.1% of the total petroleum market, and at least in terms of automobile fuel and Avgas, is relatively small. So we don't know that, we don't think actually that it will support 4 different types of fuels, but that remains to be seen. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And that is my final slide. Our flight plan basically is to focus on assisting all of the refiners, blenders, distributors, airports, FBOs, and accelerating the deployment of unleaded high-octane fuels while also maintaining 100 low lead until unleaded fuel is widely available to the public. We really want to focus on making sure that 100 low lead is maintained until we have good distribution of unleaded fuels. We don't want to have aircraft stranded due to fuel starvation. We still see automobiles running out of gas in this day and age, but it happens. And when you have deserts of pockets, if you will, where 100 low lead is not sold, when those aircraft do not either have the STC or a fleet-wide approval, it becomes a real problem, and then pilots start pushing the boundaries of where they should be going. We should always have what's called bingo fuel, reserve fuel in aircraft in order to get to alternate airports. But these things do happen, and we want to encourage that the 100 low lead remain available until 100 unleaded fuel is available on a wide basis. So we're already starting with the flight schools. Hope to get the guidance document out this week, as a matter of fact, to the flight schools to start using UL 94. It's really important for those schools to begin. Most of them do use the Cessna 172s that you see the picture of on the left for flight training. These are the trainings aircraft that future pilots that fly our commercial airlines will use to begin flight training. They're low compression, and probably 80-90% can use the UL 94 right away. So we're encouraging that. And then at the same time, we're also trying to incentivize airports to not only transition to the 94 where they can, but to also start to plan for UL 100 fuels. And then finally, working with the OEMs to modernize technology, and clearly we want to stay ahead of the regulatory changes. So with that, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, and heard some great presentations here today. So the automobile industry took 23 years to get where we're trying to go in 8 years. So it's a pretty significant task. I'm very proud to be part of Eagle. It's not easy. If it was, we would have already done so, but we are working on getting the lead out. Thank you very much.
One of the common themes of questions is, wow, Swift has done this. Why can't everyone just do it? And maybe because Chris, you were covering a lot of the stuff that's the challenges, I guess, of getting these approved and getting them in place. Maybe you guys can share a bit more about how you see how we get these lower lead, unleaded fuels out as soon as we can. Because I know that's both of your charges, and I think the audience would be very interested to hear about that.
So the challenge with UL 94 is that it takes us an isolated tank. And many airports only have a single low lead tank. They might have several jet fuel tanks. And so we knew that when we started, we introduced it into the market. Let me tell you why we introduced UL 94. we were competing with about 3 or 4 major oil and gas companies, Exxon, Shell, BP, those kind of guys, Chevron. So we were unknown at the time. We wanted to create a brand, Swift Fuels, and then we wanted to make sure that our handling of the fuel from cradle to grave was effective. So we put into place all these special provisions to try to make the thing work. We went out and focused on the sites that had a single tank available. There were some airports that had auto gas tanks, and auto gas is not effective. So we switched out and put our fuel in those tanks. But over time, a lot of airports have said, hey, you know what? I've got a spare tank, or I'm going to go find a spare tank. And this is not quite to your point, but when you introduce the 100 octane fuel, how's that going to happen? I believe that to properly introduce the new 100 octane fuel while low lead is still in the market, you have to put the new fuel into an isolated tank. Because when the new fuel is in the tank and you pull your airplane up there and use that fuel, you know what you're getting. And you know the output of your, the function of your ride, of your flight. You understand that fuel that you put in there was what's causing your plane to do what it's doing. And it's going to take a period of time. I don't know if it's going to take a year, 18 months or something like that, of using our new fuel from an isolated tank to convince that population of those pilots that it's working the way it ought to work in those kinds of airplanes. And then we'll go through the route of commingling it with low lead and other, industry wide. That's a stepping stone. So we decided that we needed those isolated tanks, and we decided to go get them with 94. But what we're going to do is we're going to switch out 94 for 100R when the time comes, and use that as the model for testing those airplanes in those airports across the country. What did we want? We wanted geographically dispersed, lots of different altitudes, lots of different climates. So look at my map, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, we're all over the place with just pockets of airports where we can prove this out to show that it works in all these different environments. That's been our plan since the beginning. It's still our plan, and we intend to follow through with that plan.
Yeah, and if I may piggyback on that, Eric, especially on the California market, you have to budget the capital expense of putting in a new tank. Then you have to do the design, engineering, construction. That takes several years. So we found that, for the communities that are really incentivized to make those changes right away, they are finding ways to get it done. But for a lot of airports out there that only have one tank and may end up with split fuels, we already have 100 low lead and jet fuel tanks out there, but that's usually the sum total of the number of tanks that the airports will have. Getting a third fuel in there for UL 94, for example, requires additional capital cost and some time to put them in. So it's something that's that doesn't happen overnight. Thank you.
One of the other things that's happening is that airports might have, let's say, 3 FBOs. So one airport, 3 gas stations for airplanes. Well, all 3 of those gas stations have one low lead tank. So what happens if one guy says, I'll take my tank and make it unleaded and the other 2 stay lead? That's okay. And that's what some people are deciding to do. In other airports, the fly-in community, the transient community flies in and out and they want to buy low lead. But the flight school, which has a bunch of UL 94 compatible airplanes in it, has a separate flight school tank. And a lot of those people are buying our fuel directly, not meant for the transient community of the airport, but only for the flight school, because they want to reap the benefits like I described to you for the flight school. There's a lot of flavors about what all's happening right now, and more. We probably add 3 or 4 airports every couple of weeks right now.
Great. We're really running out of time. We're not going to hit all these great questions. And for what is, I think, a very important industry. I think a lot of us think of the GA as just sort of people flying around for fun, but it's actually a very important industry that supports a lot of businesses. And I love this question that came in just at the end, which I think would be a great theme to end on. And Robert, our audience is a great mix of industry, airports, aviation, and community members. And this question came in is they want to know, what can communities do to be helpful to the aviation industry in this transition to unleaded fuels?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of airports out there that don't have the financial wherewithal sometimes to make these capital expenses right away. I think for communities in particular that are really concerned about this, I would suggest, city councils and county commissioners look at possibly some enterprise fund money that they might want to allocate to the airport to accelerate that process. I think that's one way of doing that. This would show to the citizens, the communities surrounding the airports, how serious the city councils and the county commissioners are about helping the airport making this transition. So I think that's one way of doing that. So we always appreciate, I like to think of airports, they're not islands unto themselves. We're part of the community. We need to be good neighbors, and airports support our communities and vice versa. The communities support the airport. So it's a collaborative effort, and I think that's one way of doing it. So thank you.
I think with that, we'll look to wrap it up. So thank you all for your attention to this. Robert gets off the hook. So Chris, you're going to have to carry his water. All the questions you may want to ask Robert, you have to ask Chris. But thank you all for your attention to this session, this panel. We really appreciate it. And thanks.